Hello students, it's Professor Dominic once again coming to you live from my office here in DSS, room 243, and today I'm going to talk to you about Chapter 1, The Art of Prehistory, which is also, in this chapter we're looking not just at the art of prehistory, but also the emergence of writing, which is very important to graphic design. So let's begin. So I'm going to go through a couple of terms before we go into some other things. First of all, what does prehistoric mean? Well, obviously prehistory. What does history mean? History is all about writing things down. When we say that a culture or a society is or was prehistoric, it means that they do not write things down. They do not have a written language. Now, this does not mean that people were not intelligent. A lot of times in these kinds of cultures, it was more about things that you could remember that was important. People would go through very elaborate things in order to memorize stories, and that's how things were passed down. Writing things down, we'll see how that developed and why that developed, but essentially prehistoric means before written history. And then you might have seen the terms BCE and CE, or if not, you've probably seen the terms BC and AD. So nowadays, it's more common for historians, art historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, scientists to use the terms BCE and CE. So BCE means before Common Era. It's meant to be more inclusive of people who are not Christian. BC meant before the birth of Christ. Now, timing is still the same. We still have the year 1 is the year after the birth of Christ. However, they just now call it before Common Era rather than like inventing a whole new calendar. And then CE stands for Common Era. At one time that was AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. So when you see years that are BCE, you will notice that, as you can see on this slide, oh, and I wrote BC, should be BCE if I'm being consistent, but you can see the Upper Paleolithic period goes from 50,000 BCE to 8,000. The numbers get smaller. Why is that? Well, because we're counting backwards up to present time, more or less. Once we get to the year 0, we start counting forward, so that becomes the Common Era, if that makes any sense. But that is why that happens. So, if people weren't writing things down, how can we learn about them? And we can infer what we know by what they left behind. We know that they used red ochre to draw on cave walls. If they mixed animal fat with that red ochre, then we're more easily able to date it through carbon dating. We know that people were nomadic, that they traveled from place to place as the weather and geography smiled on them. And we know that they had the use of fire and that they had used it for over 600,000 years. We think from the way that people left their dead behind, the way they arranged corpses, what they put into the graves, that they did believe that there was some kind of afterlife because, you know, they are thinking that maybe people are going to take these things with them into the afterlife. So the earliest surviving works of Western art date back to about 30,000 BC, which was the end of the Ice Age in Europe. Prior to this time, objects that could be used as tools were found, but after this, objects that seem to have had aesthetic purpose, meaning for beauty, emerged. And from its beginnings, graphic communication has depended not just on tools and production processes, which we will get into later, but also on visual principles, things that people see, and the design of symbolic forms, signs, and images that can be recognized according to the conventions and beliefs of a community. So, on the left, I have a handprint from a cave, in a prehistoric cave where people lived in the Dordogne region of France, many thousands of years ago, maybe about 40,000 BCE. And it's a typical type of sign that we see in these amongst prehistoric people. It's interesting, no matter where you go in the world, they're on every single continent except Antarctica, there is some kind of rock art. People are drawing on walls, and it looks very similar. In this case, it's a hand that they probably used blew the paint through straws for an early sort of airbrush technique, if you will, and made the silhouette of a hand. And we see these all over the world. And a hand is immediately recognizable. It can be a symbolic form. Now on the right, I have our logo for Cheyney University, and it is a sign and a symbolic form. When you see that banner, when you see that shield, you know it's the Cheyney shield. It is recognized according to the conventions of our community. So the creation or the design of proto-writing systems introduced by the first stable codes for graphic representation of things and quantities by signs and tokens. So basically what that means is it evolved out of the need that people had to be able to say, this is this, it is not that. And I'll get into that in a bit more depth in a moment. Right now we're still kind of at the pictographic stage where people are making images of things rather than writing things. So the other thing that we have is a meaningful organization of graphic design that depends on compositional principles such as juxtaposition, sequence, hierarchy, and direction that followed systematic rules. Now this is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. We'll see ancient Egypt in chapter 2, but I wanted to use this palette. This is the palette of Narmer. It's one of the very first artifacts that we have from the unification of ancient Egypt. And the reason I'm using this is because all of these symbols on this palette are arranged in a very particular way, and they have particular meaning. You'll notice it's also divided into 3 bands. So you've got kind of a sequence of things, you've got juxtaposition of items, and there's also a hierarchy that follows rules. And here the hierarchy is the most important person in the picture is the biggest. So this is the pharaoh. He is the biggest guy in this image, so he is the most important. So literate culture developed when a social group agreed on conventions for the representation of language by a visual code. The effects of writing as a form of social control and power spring from this consensus. So why social control? Well, let's say you have a thing. Maybe you have a pot full of grain that you want to show is yours. It's not your neighbor's, it belongs to you. So that if somebody takes that pot and they see your seal on it, they will know that you stole it, or they stole it from you. So what you're looking at here, this is a picture, obviously. This is an example of a cylinder seal. This is a round seal that you see right here, and this would have been pressed into wet clay, so you could put it on the side of something, and it's all symbolic of whomever's household that is. So that image could be impressed on things to show, this is ours. So a couple of other terms that we're going to look at. Paleos means old. Lithos means stone. So when we're talking about terms like Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic, they're describing states of cultural complexity, not chronological periods, and they also occur at different moments in different parts of the world. So artifacts of this period can be considered the origin of graphic design insofar as they present clear evidence of conscious decisions people were making about form. So one thing I want to show you where things are bolded in this presentation, if you go here to your textbook, now this is the hard copy, you guys have access to the electronic version on D2L, so I hope you're looking at it and getting information. But whenever you see a word bolded, that is one of your vocabulary words. And where can you find the definitions of your vocabulary words? Well, at the back of your book, let me tell you the page that it starts on. It starts on page, I'm almost there, page 344. You have a glossary that gives you those terms. So what's an artifact? An artifact, put my glasses down, is a thing made by human work or effort, an object whose value and identity is linked to its material existence and properties. So it's right here in the book on page 345. So I may be giving you some vocab tests, and you will find the answers right here in your book. So let's go back to talking about Upper Paleolithic sculpture, or culture actually, and what they were making. So also, I really need to redo these slides. So there should be that C up here, should be separate. It should be down here with the 25,000, and that should say BCE. So the C, when it comes before a date, means circa. It means around. They're not sure of the exact date, so it's around 25,000 BC. So Upper Paleolithic artists produced a wide range of these small sculptures that look like what you see on your screen, of usually humans, often women, animals, and combinations of the two, sometimes, anthropological combinations. And artists created other portable objects like spear throwers, musical instruments, objects of personal adornment such as beads and pendants. So when you look at this slide, before you read the caption, she looks like she could be huge, right? This looks like a giant piece of sculpture. In fact, it's about this big. It can fit in your hand. But what's significant about this is these little so-called Venuses were found all over different parts of Western Europe, and they date from about 25,000 to 21,000 BC. So although it's an object small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, the way it's carved is monumental, which means it looks very big. So it can be a literal meaning of very big, or having the quality of appearing very big. So why? Why these large ladies? So prehistoric graphic signs embody beliefs and values. So what were they believing in? So we're looking at these figures. The Venus of Willendorf is on the left. Venus of Loselle is on the right. They have very large bellies and hips. They have very large breasts. Neither one of them really possesses a face. And they both there's not an emphasis on arms and hands. You can see if you look at Venus of Willendorf, her arms are sort of crossed across her breasts, but not really, and then here, and then her feet just sort of go away, and same here. So the emphasis is on reproductive organs. So people tend to think that these little Venus sculptures represent some kind of fertility figure. The other thing about them is this is where, archaeologists think they're being cute. They called them Venuses, and this is kind of a cute little one that I found that was carved out of fluorite. It's not prehistoric. Somebody modern did this, but I'm kind of a rock hound. I like rocks. This is fluorite, and it's also an art historical reference, so I'm getting like my rock hound geek and my art history geek on with my little sculpture here. So anyway, they called her Venus because she's not conventionally beautiful. They were like, oh, ha ha, it's a Venus. So, and Venus, of course, was the Roman goddess of love and sexuality, so they thought they were being hilarious. Whatever. Anyhow, so Venus Willendorf is in the round. She has a front, she has a back, she has sides, she has a top, she has a bottom, whereas Venus of Lucelle is a relief sculpture. She is carved onto a wall and some of it protrudes. So important thing to distinction in art history. Sculpture in the round and sculpture in relief. So there's a little or a larger depiction of Venus of Lucelle. Oh, and here, this is just some examples of the type of things that people were carving and so forth during these prehistoric times. Some of these start moving into Paleolithic, or moving into Mesolithic, which means Middle Paleolithic, or Middle Stone Age. God. All right, and these are some bison that were made out of unbaked clay, but they're very realistic. That's the other thing. When we're looking at animals that people created, they really observed the form and made them look like what they were. So this is from the Cave of Running Bulls at the Cave of Lascaux in France, and again, you can see they are made to look very realistic. So prehistoric artists weren't just like grunting and groaning and doing stick figures on walls. They were taking their time and observing nature and creating things that were beautiful and naturalistic. So mark making is the most basic form of graphic expression and design. Just you make a mark. And then once made, a mark exists independently of whoever made it. So differentiating between marked and unmarked things is a conceptual act of enormous significance. And we say this because, again, this is how people began to differentiate belongings. So you might even suggest that the idea of difference forms the basis of human knowledge, and that mark making is the primary way of inscribing such differences. This is what starts to lead into people writing things. And there's our handprints from Peshmerl once again. I have this slide here because this is just an example of how things are constantly being updated and discovered, and sometimes initially might have been misinterpreted. So on the left is an image that has come to be known as the shaman of the Trois Frères Caves, or the Cave of Three Brothers, in the Dordogne region of France, and a drawing on the right by a early 20th century anthropologist named Henri Breuil, who really wanted to find a link between ancient European cultures coming up into modern times, and he called this a shaman. A shaman is somebody who in a lot of indigenous cultures works with animals on a spirit plane, so they have animistic beliefs that they can communicate with the other side through animals and so forth. And you can see how the image on the left doesn't quite look like the image on the right. It's almost like Henri Breuil had a fantasy about what he thought this image should look like, so he added a deer head and antlers to it. Yeah, so a lot of people are questioning that now. So prehistoric painters, as I mentioned, tended to approach their subjects realistically. So dating from about 15,000 to 10,000 BCE, there are renderings of bison, deer, and other game in the cave art of Altamira in Spain and Lascaux in France. They're still recognizable as what the artist intended them to be. But it's not just a likeness. The artist clearly thought about things like composition, the beauty and the elegance of the lines they were drawing. They cared about the way it looked, the care in production. They also considered scale, color, and pattern. So it's a considerable investment in the quality of the visual design. And they did not simply use raw pigments that they got from the campfire, but they mixed their pigments deliberately. And we have found things in caves like this all over the world where there's little cups or shells where pigment has been mixed, and things that look like, rudimentary handmade paintbrushes. So there's definitely something, going on here. These are not grunting cavemen. They're people that are observing their world and making marks on a wall about what they observed. And the realization that prehistoric graphic signs embody values and express beliefs place them on a continuum of time. We could do a timeline that includes contemporary design. And indeed, again, if you look in your book on page 342, just before we get to the vocab list, they have a list of dates. Actually, it does not go back to prehistoric time, but they have a list of dates. That's a timeline of graphic design. Now, as I said, it doesn't include, going back to prehistoric time or even medieval times, but that's the kind of continuum that I'm talking about, from the past up until the present. There's some reindeer. Again, they are recognizable as reindeer. Sea animals. The other thing that looking at this cave art tells us is what kind of animals were living in this region during this time. And this is a cave in Marseille, France, where there is not a sea nearby. So it's interesting that these animals appear here. Maybe there was an ancient, lake bed or something at the time, or maybe people were traveling a lot more than we think. So how did writing begin? So we have first proto-writing. So the Mesolithic period is the Middle Stone Age, from about 10,000 to 7,000 BCE, and it's characterized by the development of agriculture. You can only do that if you have a stable organization of people who remain in the same place for a period of time. So people stop being nomadic so that they can settle down and start planting plants, noting the arrangement of seasons, and so this leads to the rise of cities and civic organization in the ancient Middle East. And it's also marked by a huge leap in graphic communication, the appearance of proto-writing. So what does that mean? So this development is linked to changes in the social organization of human settlements, like the appearance of city structures within clearly defined boundaries. The invention of proto-writing coincides with the successful cultivation of hard grains at the beginning of the Neolithic or New Stone Age period, from about 8,000 to 4,000 BCE in the ancient Mesopotamian region. So again, what does this all mean? So people are living in groups, large settlements that they needed to put boundaries around. So when they began to grow more grain than they could actually eat in a season, or they could distribute immediately, they began to have some kind of accounting system to help monitor its ownership, the way it was distributed or stored. So for the first time, these signs relied on symbols designed to signify numerical values and specific objects in the world. So after about 8,000 BCE, the numeric and pictographic signs of this writing were used on tokens and clay tablets, like we saw, or clay cylinders like we saw previously, to mark ownership and quantities of goods. So proto-writing systems made use of fundamental graphic principles to order the size, shape, placement, and sequence of signs. So looking at these little things here on the slide, these look as though they're beads, but what they are little things. One of them might represent a piece of grain, maybe, or a particular kind of grain, or this is barley, this is wheat, this is for a particular type of bread, things like that. So with that, we also have accounting tokens used to make designs on clay, like you see here. So these impressions were precursors to wedge-shaped signs that become known as cuneiform, which is probably the oldest system of actual writing. So cuneiform comes from the Latin word cuneus, which means wedge-shaped, and you'll see in a moment what I mean by that. Aha, so here we go. So this is Sumerian cuneiform, and you can see all of these letters have little wedges on them, so that is where it comes from. So graphic media entered a new era when writing paper evolved in ancient Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE in an area that is known today as the Fertile Crescent. It lies between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And fully developed writing has the capacity to represent language in a stable system of signs, and cuneiform is the first known example of a system. Now, one of the things that we have in art history is new things, old things actually, are being discovered all the time, making them seem new. At least they're new to us, so it's new information. So at this time, this is the oldest type of writing that we know of, but perhaps at some point something earlier will be found, depending on how things happen. So Egyptian writing might have been a simultaneous development, or it may have evolved in part as an imitation of cuneiform scripts. We will get into ancient Egypt again in the next chapter. In China, writing emerged after 1500 BCE, and it's important to say apparently independently, so meaning without contact with other people, although some people think there are cultural influences from Europe to Asia. Again, we're a lot of information, more information than humanity has ever actually had, has been lost. So, and nobody's alive today that knows the answer. So we guess at a lot of things until we find out new things. What you're looking at here on this slide is the development of Chinese letter forms, from simpler signs into the sort of calligraphy that we're accustomed to seeing today. And then glyphic writing also originated in Mesoamerican culture, so the regions around Central America and South America around 900 BCE, in advance of contact with Europeans, and it has its own graphic rules. So this image here is from, hang on a second, so fun. Here we go. This is from what's known as the Dresden Codex from Yucatan, and dates from about 1200 to 1250 CE, so in the Common Era. This is before Europeans hit the Americas. And so what's interesting is this writing appears to have been an independent invention, and it's spaced completely differently than the way Europeans tend to do things. They also use particular glyphs, so there's writing that goes around a glyph, and there's also hieroglyphics that are, so it's an image, it's a sacred writing of something different. And what's unfortunate is, the reason I'm stumbling around this is, when the Spaniards came to the New World, they destroyed a lot of this information. So we've never really been able to completely recover the history of Central and South America, the early history. So what you're looking at here is an actual little clay tablet that has some cuneiform on it. And the signs on this clay tablet are an early form of cuneiform. Once again, some of these look wedge-shaped, some of them don't. And it's never actually been successfully translated either, unfortunately. But anyway, the number of them suggests that they represented words in a logographic script. What's logographic? So let's look again in your handy-dandy glossary. So I'm going to expect that in the future you'll do this on your own, but right now I'm just doing it. So what's a logogram or a logographic script? It is of or pertaining to a writing system that represents words with visual signs. So Egyptian hieroglyphics could also be logographic. But in any case, signs that are recovered from sites like the city of Uruk, which is now what is in Iraq, in ancient Sumeria, indicate pictographic origins, but these Sumerian pictograms, or pictures that mean something, soon become schematicized, let me turn that off, so that they could be drawn in a few quick strokes of a stylus on a writing tablet. So they're simplified and made easier to delineate. So, for instance, by 3000 BCE, before Common Era, the state bureaucracy of Uruk had 10 different numerical systems in use, each one associated with a specialized sphere of activity. And writing codified law and its enforcement came to supplement and sometimes replace violence as an instrument of power. So what are you looking at here? So here you are looking at what has come to be known as the stele. A stele, S-T-E-L-E, means a slab of rock on which something has been inscribed. So this is the law code of Hammurabi on a stele, and it's basically all down here. It's very, very large. So in this slide, we had to make it much smaller so that we could get the whole thing in. But all up and down here are all the laws. This is the first law code in history that has ever been recorded or written down, again, that we know of. And then at the top of it, what you see, this is the king, Hammurabi, and he is being handed the laws by their god, Marduk, the Sumerian god. And it's basically everything. So he's saying the gods give their power to humans. Most people in these early times are polytheistic. They believe in a whole array of gods who govern over all kinds of spheres of life, and we'll see that especially in ancient Egypt, but that's what comes out through the art. But in any case, the important thing here is this is the codification of laws, and it has all kinds of things in it that are meant to not just uphold the power of the king, but protect the weak from the strong. So it's very important. So cuneiform script spread through the Near East and was used extensively across various cultures and languages for diplomatic reasons in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. The popularity of cuneiform reached its peak in about 1400 BCE, when its diplomatic use extended throughout a region that included present-day Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Palestine, Lebanon, and Israel, all across what they now call the Levant. Cuneiform signs were used by language groups from Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, and other families, and the adoption of a writing system developed for one language by another is a pattern that we see many times in the history of script. So if you were to do an actual study, which you may wind up doing for assignment 1, you will actually be doing some study into a writing system that you pick. So I'll get into that a little bit later, but in any case, what you'll see is, for example, the Viking runes. If you look in your textbook on page 13, I don't have them in the slideshow, but the runes, a lot of people think the runes came from ancient Etruscan writing. So it's kind of interesting. And then if you look at the runes, the writing that became adopted by Anglo-Saxon people for writing down Saxon languages and ancient English languages in the Middle Ages looks a lot like runic letters as well. So it's very interesting in what became adapted for writing in ancient Rome. Actually, it was ancient Tuscany that it came from first. So now we'll go into, I'm going to go away from this textbook and start getting a little bit into the other textbook with the Neolithic period, from about 8,000 or 6,000 to 4,000 BCE, depending on where you are. And a lot of this is in Northern Europe. What you're looking at is the white chalk horse of Uffington, which appears in Great Britain. And it's visible from the air that ancient people, we don't know why, outlined this horse in white chalk on this plain. And how did they do it? How did they know what they were doing? Because, you can only see it from the sky. So in Western Europe, as elsewhere through the world, there is a revolutionary shift from hunting and gathering to farming. So again, people stopped being nomadic and they settled down and started to build large monuments out of stone. And megaliths are built of huge stones without the use of mortar. And so mega means big, lith means stone, and we're going to see all kinds of megalithic monuments. So what you're looking at here is a tomb in megalithic Donegal in Northern Ireland. And we'll talk about this particular construction as well, because we see it all across the British Isles. But before we do that, we're going to Malta. So Malta is an island between Italy and North Africa, and the type of structure that we're going to look at is a little bit different here, but we will see megaliths here. So again, big stones without the use of mortar. But what's interesting here, look at our figure here. This is a giant standing figure of a large naked woman. And what are they emphasizing? Her hips and thighs. So, there's like this fertility theme or something going on here. So the megaliths on Malta and the adjoining island of Gozo are now dated to before 3000 BCE, and Maltese temples are freestanding structures. There was a civilization there that lasted some 800 years and then disappeared following an invasion. So the biggest temple, Gantija, which means Tower of the Giants, is built on a hill and faces downward, and the front, the facade, was originally 50 feet high, and the exterior was constructed of rough, uncut limestone slabs, which were rolled down to the site on limestone balls, or so they think. And then all these walls are like tightly packed stone going all the way around here, and then these are like open courtyards. And you'll see this kind of reminds me of, so here's like a head. This could be the arms and the breasts, the waist, the bottom part of a female body, perhaps. And then you enter the womb of the body. So a lot of people look at things like this and they think, oh, this was like a culture of matriarchs, meaning women ruled. We don't know for sure. Nothing's written down, but that's one of the things. Here's a nice drawing that gives you a better idea of what it looks like. It's a little bit clearer. So it shows that the exterior walls surrounded two temples, and the one to the left is a little bit earlier, and its sanctuary is tri-lobed, meaning these circles, 3 circles come out. And it's larger than the oval space down here that precedes it. And then in the northern temple at the right, the sizes are reversed. The sanctuary up here is smaller, and the oval forecourt is larger. Why? I don't know. So here is a photograph then of what it looks like. And they gave a lot of attention to the elaborate inner sanctuaries, more so than what the outside looked like. And here you can see an entryway with steps leading up to a parapet, which is a wall around a terrace or balcony. And then one curve of the oval forecourt of the southern temple is lined with platforms that resemble altars. So people would come in and leave offerings and that sort of thing. So there's also evidence that the stone oval at the entrance to the temple was a hearth used in ceremonies and rituals. And here I have, so if you go back here, this is about here. In the next slide, I have humans here, so you get an idea of the scale of the size of it. So the most dramatic surviving statue here, oh my God, there's this huge, again, figure, probably a mother goddess. She's got these huge, huge thighs and little teeny feet, and then a pleated skirt, pleated or fringed, kind of interesting. And she was probably, a huge, gigantic figure. And the abundance of smaller, obese figures show, again, like I said, it all goes back to fertility. And so a number of these were found covered around the legs with red ochre to suggest the blood of childbirth. And the rounded plains, as I said, of the temples and tombs might have been interpreted as symbolizing wombs. So it's kind of a womb to tomb idea. You come out of the womb at birth, and then you go back into the womb of the goddess after you die. So the earth goddess and human burial is most direct at Hal Saflieni, which is where a necropolis, a city of the dead, has yielded the remains of over 7,000 human bodies in addition to the statues of females. So again, we think that there's this idea of an underground goddess, a Chthonian goddess. So here is one of those very large statues or sculptures of women, and this is often known as the sleeping goddess statue. And there's holes that provide worshippers with access to the underworld where they could pour ritual libations. And then there's also images of the sick or crippled along with these sculptures of reclining females. So people think that the temple somehow had curative powers. You could go there and rest and become healed. And we seem to think that it was thought most effective if you lay on the sanctuary floor, much the way that the goddess is laying there. So now we'll go back to Northern Europe and look at these huge rocks, megaliths. So Neolithic megaliths in Ireland, Britain, France, and Spain, and Italy are of a different character from the ones that were discovered on Malta. In Northern Europe, we have three distinctive types of stone structures. We have the menhir, we have the dolmen, and the cromlech. And these terms are Celtic in origin. So a menhir, it comes from a Brittonic word, going back to the Celts, that relates to the terms men, meaning stone, and here, meaning lawn. And it includes all erected stones, so upright stones, and they can be found in singly, in series, and in sets. So a cromlech is a group of standing stones, or menhirs, arranged in a roughly circular pattern, like you see here, often with one or more outliers, and they can be very impressive. The biggest cromlech in the world is at Stonehenge, or they can be very simple, as the drawing there on a circle of upright stones. And then a dolmen is where you have three or more standing stones supporting a capstone, as we have here. This would be considered a dolmen, and we'll talk about what this is for in a moment. And you create more chambers by adding more stones and capstones. So the Celts, Celt is a term that is used for Neolithic megaliths in Western Europe. By the way, if anybody's from Boston and you've heard of the Boston Celtics, that is an incorrect pronunciation. Celt should have a hard C, actually. So anyway, Celtic terms are used for Neolithic megaliths in Western Europe because a large number of them are located in regions that were later inhabited by Celtic peoples. So the Celts were first identified in the basin of the Upper Danube River and southern Germany in the 2nd millennium BC. And although they're of mixed origins, they spoke related Indo-European languages. And from the early to 9th century BCE, the Celts began to migrate through Western Europe, as you can see on this map here. And they went and occupied as far west and north as France, Spain, Portugal, northern Italy. They sacked Rome in 390 and BCE, and the British Isles and in Greece. And Gaelic-speaking Celts settled in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And Celtic dialects are still spoken in Great Britain, Ireland, northern France, and actually parts of northern Spain known as Galicia. So the rigidly organized social structure of the Celts was ruled by a chief, and they worshipped many gods, again, polytheistic. They believed in the immortality of the soul, and Celtic priests called druids supervised education, religion, and the administration of justice. And the rich Celtic tradition forms the basis of much European folklore. And here's a little thing about the Celts, because in television series they are sort of mythologized in a way and romanticized, and the Druids are often made of much more than what they actually were. They were really, the Druids were the literate part of Celtic society. They were like the bureaucrats. They were the priests, but they were also the bureaucrats of Celtic structure, and they had very sharply divided hierarchical laws, and again, they were pre-literate. Everything everything was passed down through memory. It was very important to be able to recite things. And they had some writing, but it came about much later. So going back to our menhirs, so here's a nice picture of some menhirs in Carnac in Brittany in northern France. So these are also known as monoliths. Mono for one, lith meaning stone, and generally standing upright in the ground, erected individually, in clusters, or in rows, as we see here in Carnac. And Carnac was probably an important Neolithic religious center, and menhirs have been interpreted as symbolizing the phallic power of the male fertilizing the Mother Earth. And then dolmen comes from the Celtic word dal, which means table, and this is a color version of what we had earlier. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about this one. So they're chambers or enclosures consisting of 2 or more vertical stones containing supporting a large stone or a capstone, the way that legs support a table. And the earliest dolmens were built as tombs, each one enclosing a body, and then later additions turned them into passageways. And we see these particularly in Ireland, and a lot of these would on the inside have engravings or paintings and so forth, and they were imbued by Neolithic people with symbolic associations. Stone burial monuments would function as links between the present time and eternity. So stone lasts forever. You're not just putting somebody in the ground, you are putting something on top of that burial so that it will stand for all eternity. And we see this again in ancient Egypt when they start to use stone for their burials, but they are a bit more sophisticated about it, if you'll forgive me for saying so. These are very roughly hewn, and no doubt it took enormous work to get them to their locations, but we'll see with the pyramids that they're a whole other ball of wax. So a cromlech, once again, crom means circle, lech means place, and they are megalithic structures in which groups of menhirs are arranged to form circles or semicircles, and by far the greatest number of stone circles or cromlechs are found in Britain. And cromlechs must have played a major role in their culture, since the effort to build them was extraordinary, and the function and symbolism of their circular forms has not been exactly determined, but they clearly mark sacred spaces. So here is a photograph of modern-day Stonehenge. A lot of the stones have toppled down. It's thousands of years old, and people are coming in and visiting it. And so again, having a human figure in there gives you an idea of the scale of the size of the stones. And this is an artist's reconstruction of what Stonehenge might have looked like originally, with all of the stones intact. And so the most famous cromlech, as I keep saying, is Stonehenge, and it was actually built in several stages over a period of a very long time, from about 2800 to 1500 BCE. And most of the original stones have fallen. This is a drawing of the original floor plan of Stonehenge. And so it's a circular area of land on a gradually sloping ridge, and that was a sacred site long before 3000 BCE. So originally they dug barrows or burial mounds surrounded by a ditch about 350 feet in diameter, and then entering the circle was a mile-long avenue hollowed out of earth, and it runs in an east-west direction, and then 50 or 60 pits, or 56 pits rather, were added inside the circular ditch and filled with rubble or cremated human bones. And around the same time they created the heel stone, a block of sandstone 16 feet high, set in the place outside the ditch in the entrance. And then the first stone circle, consisting of smaller stones called blue stones, which come from a different area than the later stones, was constructed around 2500 BCE. And then over the next 400 years, a new group of people came in, and they were assimilated into the native population over time, and they brought new technology to the area, and they believe that they're the ones that completed Stonehenge. So it's very interesting. that this was completed by the Beaker people, as they say, and this is just a very far distant aerial view of what Stonehenge looks like today, but you can see that there's you can see from the air, this is the kind of aerial photography that shows us where things have been dug. And nowadays there's been discovered, again, using this aerial photography, the technology gets better and better. They've discovered that not too terribly far from Stonehenge was a place called Woodhenge, which it's a modern name, of course, but that there were similar ditches created and posts made of wood were put there, and based on the kinds of things that were left there, like leavings of animal bits that look like they were butchered and then eaten, we think that Woodhenge was a place where for the living, where people lived, and then Stonehenge was a place of the dead, where you could go and memorialize your dead. Again, the idea of stone monuments being permanent. So the outer circle of Stonehenge, and this is an important art historical term, so the outer circle of Stonehenge is a post and lintel construction, and this is one of the very first forms of architecture that we have. It exists in ancient Egypt, it exists in Turkey, in Göbekli Tepe, so it's very old, and it's basically very simple. You have your upright posts, as you see here, and they support a lintel. And so each post is a sandstone block, 13 feet high and rougher on the outside than the inside. And then at the top, you have a little bulge called a tenon, and then on the underside of the cab, which would be right about here, you have a little niche carved out so that mortise fits on top of the tenon. And then for the outer wall, when the lintels were slightly curved to create the lintels were slightly curved to create a circle when they were attached end to end. So that's the end of this slideshow. I'm about to upload it, and then I'm going to give you assignment 2 very shortly. It depends on how long it takes me to upload this, so just keep an eye over the weekend on D2L, and I hope you have a good weekend, and I will hopefully talk to you all very soon.